Hi guys, starting to look like an old English sheepdog, but it's going to be a long time before I get a haircut, so we'll just have to put up with it. Okay, so I am continuing with Truman and the Cold War. We talked about Truman's policy of containment, not eliminating communism because that looks impossible, but containing the spread of communism in Japan, in Germany, East Germany after the war and the split of Berlin, in Greece, other few places, but those are the main ones. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Truman today, do some bio on him, and possibly get into, maybe not, but get into the next phase, which is the Red Scare. The Riverside class has a good PowerPoint on this called Truman and Containment. I don't know what happened to the Hayes class. I will try and move it over and see if I can copy and get that one in there, but you'll have to go back to the textbook if you're in Hayes and work with the photos in there because something's missing. Something did not transfer correctly. Anyway, Truman. Truman is always ranked as not a great president, but as a near great. And he has risen over time. When he left office, he was not considered exceptional. Today, he is considered one of the best presidents we've had. Why? He made decisions, very difficult decisions, that shaped our world today. He had huge problems ending the war, after the war, what to do with Europe, what to do with Japan and the atom bomb. And he said, I'm just an ordinary man. Faced with great, great challenges, he, in every single case, looking in hindsight, made the right decisions. As somebody said, he did the big things right. One thing I forgot to mention too, besides the Marshall Plan, of course, after the war, immediately after the war, is the GI Bill. And this is one of the best things America ever did. For our returning soldiers, of which there were millions of them, we gave them a year of free college tuition for every year they served. Now we have updated that. For a while it wasn't very good, but it has recently been, benefits have been increased, and we are getting close to what we gave at the end of World War II. This was not only a good philosophical idea, it was a very pragmatic idea. Most of the GIs, not all, but a huge proportion of them went back and took advantage of college degrees. If you look under Truman and Containment, you can see what happened in slides 5 and 6. Colleges were swamped. In fact, I've seen pictures of UT where there was no place to put them, where professors had offices and broom closets, where classes were being taught on the mall, they were being taught in hallways. All of a sudden, you have millions of ex-GIs who are flooding college campuses. The upshot is 4 years later, you have millions of college graduates. This jumpstarts the post-war economic boom, another huge period of economic development in America. College graduates are a good thing, not only for the college graduates, they get good paying jobs, they pay more taxes, they help the country develop. This is why Europe provides free college education to most students if they qualify. We talk about it again more, but we don't do it as well as Europe does. This is a win-win-win proposition, and we should do more of it, in my personal opinion. So, Harry Truman, a good guy, a near great president in hindsight. Who is Harry Truman? He was born basically nobody. He was born in rural Missouri. Father had a number of jobs. He was a livestock dealer who bought and sold horses and cattle. And the dad married a pretty wealthy young woman in the area that had a college degree. So it's Truman's mother that pushes education. Harry Truman is not physically presidential material. He's short. He's a slight guy. He's not a big guy. Had a thick prairie accent, had very poor eyesight, Coke bottle glasses, never played sports, but he loved to read. By the time he was in high school, he had read every book in the town library. Not saying much, it was a small town, but still that's quite an accomplishment for a 13-year-old kid. There was no money for college in his family, so he went and helped his grandfather's farm and became a farmer, was a community leader in the town, became a Democratic Party leader. World War I comes along, he joins the army and became an artillery captain, which I've always wondered about because he had really bad eyesight. But in any way, he was very brave. He was very cool under fire. Came back after World War I, was a farmer. The Depression hits, business failed. He had opened a small store in town. The store went bankrupt, so he joined a local political party. It was the only job available, basically. He got into politics accidentally. He became part of a very strong political organization in Kansas City, Missouri. It is absolutely a corrupt political machine. He knew it was corrupt. Harry Truman, there has never been a speck of evidence that Harry Truman himself was corrupt, but he was involved with a corrupt political machine, and that followed him into politics. He was elected U.S. Senator in 1934, barely reelected in 1938. Franklin Roosevelt picks him as his vice presidential running mate in his third term. Why? Because Harry Truman was a nobody, was a small town guy, was not going to threaten Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt didn't want competition in the job. But he was a strong supporter of the New Deal, Truman was, and New Deal programs. In World War II, he became Franklin Roosevelt's head of basically efficiency and anti-corruption. And this has been mentioned a lot with this huge bailout with the coronavirus. Who is going to oversee this? Who is going to make sure that all this money going out very quickly, billions of dollars, does not end up in the wrong place? The person in World War II who did that, and again, we're talking billions of dollars, was Harry Truman. And by all accounts, he did an excellent job, and there was almost no corruption. So he has some background here. He had only been vice president for a short period of time when Franklin Roosevelt dies, and all of a sudden, Harry Truman is an accidental president. He never wanted the presidency. He never expected it. He would never have run on his own. And he said when he became president, "I never think of anyone as president but Mr. Roosevelt." But when he did become president, he said very famously as well, "Now I'm doing what I damn well please, and to hell with all the rest of them." So this is a very small, unimpressive guy with a lot of background. The other thing that's very famous about Harry Truman is he put on his desk in the Oval Office a sign, a little plaque that says, "The buck stops here." That means I'm responsible. I take the responsibility. This has been brought up about 30 times in the last week because President Trump has said, "I'm not responsible for this. I'm not responsible for getting N95 masks or the supplies. That's the governor's responsibility." Harry Truman had a plaque on his desk that says, "I'm responsible. The buck stops here." So he is an accidental president. He has huge problems. He deals with Berlin. He deals with Greece. He deals with the Marshall Plan. He deals with the GI Bill. And in 1948, he is running again. 1948 is another very interesting election because there are three Democratic candidates. Republicans, not an issue. They had one candidate, a united party. There are three Democrats running. First, Harry Truman, who is the incumbent. Then you had two Southerners. Wallace was not a Southerner. You had another Northerner who thought that Harry Truman was too liberal. And you had Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond is an interesting character. He came from South Carolina, and his entire campaign is segregation now, segregation forever. And that is what he's running on. Because the Democratic Party, if you remember, is, after Franklin Roosevelt, a party in the South. It was South after Lincoln's election, after Lincoln's assassination, and it stayed Democratic when African Americans finally joined FDR's New Deal coalition. Then the South is solidly Democratic, black and white. This was a huge factor because the Democratic Party, of course, is split between Northern liberals and Southern conservatives. Southern conservatives were called not Democrats, but Dixiecrats. Dixie, the old word for the South. And the Dixiecrats walked out of the Democratic convention and picked their own candidate. Instead of supporting Truman, they ran Strom Thurmond. They blamed Harry Truman for problems with Russia. They ran Franklin Roosevelt's vice president in his third term, Henry Wallace, who was a little bit softer on Russia. And the Republicans ran Thomas Dewey, a very competent, experienced New York governor, but a very cold fish, not a warm personality. Harry Truman doesn't think he's going to win. It's too split. He's expecting the Republican candidate Dewey to walk in. He campaigned hard, even though he believed he would lose. He had what he called a whistle-stop campaign. He went on a train tour of 32,000 miles across the country, gave close to 400 speeches, would stop at every small town along the way. Whistle stop is a place where there's not even a train station, that the train whistles when it stops there if you want to get on or get off. Over 2 months, he was giving 7 speeches and more a day. And he adapted his speeches to the local constituents, to the local population. So when he's in Iowa, he's talking about corn crops. When he's in Wyoming or Texas, he's talking about cattle raising. People absolutely loved it. He was folksy. He was an ordinary Joe. He had grown up on a farm. He knew how to talk to farmers. He used things like horse manure. He called people, oh, he's full of horse manure. And of course, the public absolutely loved it. This doesn't sound like much, but in the 1940s, this is pretty serious language. This was pretty extreme. He also said, are you dumb enough to vote for these guys? Vote for me instead. And the crowd response became in every stop, give him hell, Harry. The New Deal coalition held. There's a great photo of Truman holding up the newspaper. He went to bed assuming he had lost the election. Newspapers are printed in the middle of the night so they can go out early in the morning. And that's where the headlines, Dewey wins, comes in. Because the newspapers printed it before the count came in, when it became apparent that Harry Truman had actually won. So he has 50% Democrats in Congress. He has 45% Republicans. He has a Democratic majority, but the Democratic majority is split between Dixiecrats and Northern Democrats. First thing he does when he's sworn in for his second term, but really he had inherited Roosevelt's term, so it's his own election this time. He increased the minimum wage from 40 to 75 cents. He almost doubled it. So imagine doubling the minimum wage today. He added 10 million more people to Social Security, and he increased rent subsidies for the poor. He is known as a foreign affairs president. He had no foreign affairs experience when he was elected. He did have a lot of experience in America, but here he's not very successful at all. There was inflation after the war he had to deal with. He did pass the GI Bill. He did get the Marshall Plan through, but GI Bill is a domestic one. Marshall Plan is strictly overseas. He attempted to keep increasing the New Deal programs. He was a New Dealer. He strongly believed in it, but he has some big issues. He also tried, and one of the first presidents to do it, to increase civil rights for African Americans. He himself was totally unprejudiced, and with an executive order, because he couldn't get it through Congress with the Dixiecrats, with an executive order, he orders complete integration of government agencies and jobs. Again, this is immediately after he is elected on his own. He famously integrated the military. This was not done in World War II. It was not done by Franklin Roosevelt. Harry Truman integrated the military after 1948. He opened federal jobs to African Americans in the Fair Employment Practices Acts. I don't care about the name. Basically, he opened up federal jobs to African Americans. for the first time in a long time. He appointed the first Civil Rights Commission to investigate the condition of African Americans in 1946. What this did, of course, is completely split the Democratic Party and made really strong enemies out of the Dixiecrats, who fought at that point everything that Harry Truman wanted to do. Okay. Now we can get back. We're both on the slides for the Hayes class. You are now in Cold War and on, and I start with the Red Scare, the Red Menace. In Riverside class, I'm starting with slide 19 and 20. Okay. Red, of course, is the color of communism. Were they paranoid? Was this really a threat? If you look in the 1940s, 1950s, communism was not an empty threat. Communism was real. Only Russia had been communist at the beginning of World War II. Russia gets the atomic bomb in 1949. There are only two nations, us and Russia, have atomic power. That's pretty threatening. 1949, China goes communist. 1950-51, you begin to get spy trials in America. Do we have Russian spies in America? Absolutely, no question about it. Were they hiding under everybody's bed? No, probably not. But there were Russian spies here, and there were nationally televised trials of Russian spies or suspected Russian spies. 1950, we have the Korean War. You have a civil war in Greece. You have Russia closing off Eastern Europe behind what they called an Iron Curtain, literally nothing in, nothing out. You have investigations in both houses of Congress on suspected Russian collaborators. In 56, Russia crushes a Hungarian revolt. The Hungarians revolted for their independence. You have Russia moving into the Mideast. In 1959, you have Sputnik, the first Russian satellite in space, and we become incredibly paranoid about that. Okay, Russia's moving into space. What's going to happen? You have, in 1960, an American spy plane over Russia shot down and the pilot held captive by the Russians. In 62, you have the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we have missiles next door in Cuba. So it's not pure paranoia. Russia, communism at least, was expanding around the world, and this is the Cold War. Both sides have atomic power now, and it becomes a balance of terror. How do you keep the other guy from bombing the crap out of you? You have more missiles than he does, so that if he attacks, he knows he will be wiped off the face of the earth. And the only solution to that is to build more and more and more missiles, which is not a great solution to this problem. Okay, Korean War, starting on slide 19. Hayes, you have to go to the book in this until I move the slides over. At the end of World War II, what's going on in Korea? Japanese had occupied Korea in World War II. And at the end of the war, the southern half of Korea surrendered to the United States. The northern half of Korea surrendered to the Russians. On both sides, they set up their own governments, democracy in the south, communism in the north. 1950, in the middle of nowhere, North Korea invades South Korea. They were very successful. This was a surprise attack, and they almost push American troops out of South Korea. We hung on to a tiny little corner of it. The assumption was at the time that this was connected with communism and connected with Russia, that Russia was really running this operation. From what we know now, this was probably, to all extents and purposes, a North Korean action that they did without the knowledge and consent of Russia. The North Korean dictator today is the grandson of the guy who did this. How sane that whole family is, I'm not sure about that. But what are you going to do about it, Harry Truman? If you follow your policy of containment, you have to stop the Russians from taking over all of Korea. And Harry Truman went to the United Nations. The United Nations voted to help South Korea. And the United Nations assembled an international military force to defend South Korea. They were, of course, 61% South Koreans, about a third Americans, and only about 6% other European nations. The United Nations had no tanks. We had no heavy artillery in the Korean Peninsula, but we did have a lot of troops and equipment in Japan. We were occupying Japan after World War II. The guy in charge of occupied Japan, again, was Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur is ordered to go and defend South Korea. So he has an amphibious landing. He goes behind the North Korean lines at Incheon to break their line, and then actually breaks through and pushes the North Koreans back very quickly. He pushes them back to the Chinese border. When he gets to the Chinese border, MacArthur starts talking about, let's just invade China. Not only can we keep North Korea, but we have the troops and the manpower here. Let's just go on and invade China. It's communist. I think I can take it and make it democratic again. Truman, this is released to the press because we have reporters along on all these expeditions. Truman says, what are you talking about, MacArthur? We just got through with the war. We're occupying Japan. We're trying to hold on to South Korea. What are you talking about invading China? There's over 1 billion people there. They have an army of millions of men. You can't invade China and defeat communism in China. In November 1950, the Chinese and the North Koreans, and now we definitely have Chinese involvement, they push back. They push back American troops and South Korean troops to the middle of the peninsula, to the 38th parallel, that line across the middle of the Koreas. And we finally retreated to that line. And that's where we have stayed for now about 70 years. Huge casualties. This is a bitter war. Korea is very cold in the winter, a lot of frostbite, a lot of injuries. Total casualties, about 2 million people from 18 different countries. Seoul, which is near the border of North Korea, was captured and recaptured about 4 times before the Southern forces finally held it. At the end of the war, the United Nations traded 75,000 North Koreans and Chinese POWs for about 4,000 American and 9,000 South Korean POWs. Why we are 70 years later still at the 38th parallel. The North Koreans went on to create the most extreme and pure communist country on the face of the earth. South Korea, of course, today is a strong American ally, democratic, and very, very capitalist. The border has never been demilitarized. It still exists as a border. There's about a 10-mile zone in between, and now it's a biological research station because for 70 years, nobody has lived there, nobody has walked there. And biologists from both sides are allowed in to do biological studies because it's an absolutely pristine environment. Korean War creates, again, a lot of bitterness. This is a war, but it's an undeclared war. Technically a UN maneuver, but heavy American involvement. It is, again, another land war in Asia. Douglas MacArthur kept talking about invading China. Truman says, knock it off. He doesn't. Truman goes to Korea, meets with Douglas MacArthur, tells him knock it off. Douglas MacArthur doesn't. Truman gets back to Washington and fires him. Why? You don't disobey the president. The president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and he puts another commander in place. This is, again, an issue today. Do military commanders challenge the president? It's a very touchy issue, and this is a great example. Douglas MacArthur, of course, is the guy who disobeyed Hoover in 1930 and burned and destroyed the Bonus Army camp. So he has a long history of not listening to presidential orders. Okay, so next time we'll all be on the same page, and we are talking about the Red Menace. We are talking about the communist threat not overseas, but in America, particularly with the House Un-American Activities and the McCarthy hearings. McCarthy is a name that everybody should know in American history. Stay safe and stay warm.